You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 409 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Really full show lined up today. Assange's extradition hearing, possibly restarting the talks with the Taliban, and what's going on in Syria after last week we had Trump announce some U.S. troops will be withdrawn. All right, everybody, I need you to either share the show or recommend it to a friend. You go to the libertarianinstitute.org, find the show in the right-hand column of the homepage there, along with the daily news roundup that I write. If you're a new listener to the show and you like it, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube. The show should be up everywhere people listen to podcasts. If you're a frequent listener to the show and you want to donate to it, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, like I said, a lot to cover on today's show. So the show notes page is going to be a great resource. There'll be tons of links in it if you want to know more about any of these things. First off, the United States President Donald Trump has accepted the resignation of his Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry. Now, of course, especially for libertarians, we got a big kick out of Rick Perry getting nominated to be Secretary of Energy as one of his, most fatal moments on the debate stage was, of course, forgetting what agencies he wanted to cut and then looking to his to the debater to the right, Ron Paul, and kind of saying like, hey, Ron, what were those agencies I want to cut? Now, of course, Ron Paul wanted to cut all of them, but it was actually the Department of Energy is something that Rick Perry wanted to cut. And then, of course, Trump names him to head the Department of Energy. Now, the reason the Department of Energy is even important to talk about on this podcast, similarly, I don't talk much about Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, just because, typically that's not something that has a lot to do with foreign policy. But in the case of the Department of Energy, it's actually where the U.S. nuclear weapons are kind of housed on the budget and in some ways are under the authority of the Secretary of Energy. So there's a lot of, of the defense budget actually buried in the Department of Energy because, that's where they care and maintain for the U.S. nukes. But it's also important in this kind of diplomatic sense that we're now seeing unfold with Saudi Arabia, as we're looking to give Saudi Arabia a nuclear energy technology, and then negotiations around that. It gets into kind of a very interesting thing here where it's the U.S. government that's actually doing the negotiation with Saudi Arabia. And so, I guess if you're looking at a reflection of the U.S. people, it would probably not be to provide this technology to Saudi Arabia to begin with, because if you give them nuclear energy, then kind of the same situation with Iran. There is the potential that they could eventually use a lot of that civilian technology to build a nuclear weapon. And certainly we've seen the Saudi kingdom at least put out that they're willing to build a nuclear weapon in response to Iran building a nuclear weapon. Now, as I've talked about on the show, there's really not, I don't think, a huge concern of Iran building a nuclear weapon, at least not before Saudi Arabia does. However, we've seen in the past, just go down and ask Americans, like, is Iran building a nuclear weapon or does Iran have a nuclear weapon? Most people believe they do because there's just a massive propaganda campaign. And so I guess I could see the potential that if we give Saudi nuclear technology, that they could likewise kind of jump on the bandwagon of there's something Israel would say, while they won't admit to their nuclear weapons, they will, kind of say that they need such a robust military and so much American protection because of the threat that Iran has or is building a bomb. And, you can see Saudi Arabia doing the same thing. Well, we need a bomb because Iran has one, even though there's, no proof of that. And it doesn't look like that. It certainly hasn't been anything Iran is pursuing so far. So, I was kind of concerned that you have this dope Rick Perry, who didn't even know the agency that he wanted to cut. And I really don't think he's a very bright guy. Negotiating with Saudi Arabia. And it does look like there was some information passed to Saudi Arabia regarding nuclear technology really prior to when it should have been at least getting any kind of approval or whatever, rubber stamp that Congress would usually put on it. One of the things going on here, and the reason that this nuclear deal hasn't happened yet, actually, is the U.S. wants to have Saudi get into a 1-2-3 agreement. I don't actually understand all the little details of how the nuclear process works under it, but essentially the U.S. would provide Saudi Arabia nuclear technology and reactors that take it a long way away from the material you would need to make a bomb. But even in that case, the Saudis wouldn't enrich their own uranium. They would ship it to the United States, we enrich it for them and send it back. And I guess this is the deal that the UAE signed on to. Now, from my understanding, the Saudis are refusing this and wanting to, pursue their own enrichment, which, assuming they master the fuel cycle of being able to enrich uranium, while they may only be, seeking the technology to enrich up to 3.6%. And, that is something that I don't think the Americans should prevent Saudi Arabia from doing. But, it's a little bit different since we're talking about selling it to them. Then they could enrich that uranium more and more, and again, eventually use enough or have enough to make a bomb. So, that's, I guess, kind of the troublesome and worries there. And if I don't get all the nuclear science right, feel free to send me an article explaining it better. But that is why the Secretary of Energy is important. I don't know who this guy who replacing Rip Perry is, other than it is Rip Perry's former number 2. His name is Dan Brouillette. And again, he was, I guess, number 2 at Department of Energy. Trump announced the resignation of Perry and his replacement kind of all in one tweet stream there. 3 U.S. soldiers died in a training accident. It sounds like a Bradley fighting vehicle somehow overturned, flipped over, or in some way got submerged in water. And then 3 soldiers were killed and 3 others were injured. Sometimes you wonder how much kind of unnecessary use and strain you're putting on the U.S. military to be deployed to all these different theaters around the world, whether it's Eastern Europe, Korea, Nigeria, or Afghanistan. We're kind of using all of our, a lot of our resources militarily. And so if maybe more soldiers are ending up dying just because rather than having our soldiers at home and training and, not putting so much wear and tear on our equipment, not, much less our soldiers who, had to go and serve multiple tours of duties because these wars never end, maybe you don't have quite so many of these deaths. Interesting article, and I believe it's War is Boring, and again, linked in the show notes page, on just how much U.S. ships, Navy ships that are coming off the line now are terrible. They bring up a couple examples of the Fort Zumwalt destroyers, the Littoral Movement ships, and then the Ford class of aircraft carriers. These are, multi-billion-dollar ships in total, costing Americans tens of billions of dollars. That's probably a low end if it's not in the hundreds of billions for all of these ships. And they all have critical failures that make them fairly useless in combat. For example, explosions going off near the Ford class of aircraft carrier shuts down the lifts so that, the airplanes that are stored underneath, and I guess, they probably land and, go down there to refuel and, get more weaponry or whatever, essentially how you would have an aircraft carrier battle. Well, those lifts stop working, which essentially just makes the aircraft carrier, I would assume, a sitting target that, the ships aren't particularly maneuverable because they are so large. And if their aircraft can't deploy to defend them, it seems like, they're relatively vulnerable. And that being a real problem with that class of, aircraft carriers. Talked about the Zumwalt class in the past, and those ships are prone to rolling over, which seems almost unbelievable. But that was a result of trying to make them so stealth. And they also lack a main cannon, to kind of do all the important things a ship does, like a destroyer, like shooting. The U.S. has imposed more sanctions on Cuba, this time blocking Cubans' access to commercial aircraft. This is in response for what Trump says are Cuban human rights violations. But I think if you're, kind of putting it, the bold reason would be support for the Maduro government. So this is just kind of another path of the maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela. The U.S. extended sanctions waivers that Iraq gets to import Iranian energy, so, gas and fuel and that kind of stuff, for another 120 days. This is maybe the only country in the world left that's getting these waivers to buy Iranian oil. Yeah, this is Iraq. And people have even mentioned how it's possible that Saudi Arabia actually start to import some of Iraqi oil in order to offset what they were losing, to fill the contracts after the pipeline was attacked on the 14th. And so it's possible that, the oil was going from Iran to Iraq to Saudi Arabia. But, it kind of remains the importance that, the U.S., there's this new relationship between Iraq and Iran that's formed because of the U.S. intervention in the area. This is the one thing that Scott Horton always talks about when he talks about foreign policy. He likes to bring it back to this very important point that, Iraq and Iran were enemies up until the 2003 U.S. invasion and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and getting rid of his entire government, and then having democratic elections in a primarily Shia country that was friendly with their Shia next door neighbors, the Iranians. And so it completely changed what was happening in Iraq. And of course, there was the terrible civil war fought in the capital city there at Baghdad that kicked the majority of Sunnis out of that city in an extremely brutal and gruesome fashion. And now, even as the U.S., in one sense, we got 5,000 troops deployed to that country. We pretty much set up the government 16 years ago, or I guess closer to 13 years ago for that one. And yet we have to allow, Iraq to import Iranian oil, even though Trump is trying to massively isolate Iran because of the situation, that our intervention creates in the area, the completely unforeseen problems and conflicts that come of it. CNN is reporting that, about, I believe in March, they put out a study or a report saying that, hey, we kind of traced some U.S. weapons that were sold to the UAE in 2014, including armored vehicles that are now in the hands of jihadist groups or even seized by the Houthis in Yemen. And apparently CNN has found that these vehicles were used against the Saudi forces as the UAE-backed southern separatists in Yemen decided to split away from, at least for a period of time, and seize the second capital city of Yemen, which is Aden, from the Saudi-backed government. So again, this is a very interesting kind of, I guess always be a smaller event in the Yemeni war, where you have what should have been two, allying groups, which were the Saudi-backed side and the UAE-backed side, at least as you see those two groups as kind of geopolitical allies. But within Yemen, their proxies start fighting against each other, and the UAE-backed side sees the capital city from the Saudi side. The second, capital city, the Saudi-backed government has lost in this war so far, and I think just shows that there's no way that the Saudi mission here to put Hadi, the leader of the Yemeni government, back as the leader of Yemen is impossible. He can't even rule the small percentage of the Yemeni population that he currently controls in South Yemen. The U.S. has restored aid to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Trump revoked it some months ago because these countries weren't doing enough to prevent the immigration crisis. I have no idea if they actually took any meaningful steps to go against, what they're calling the immigration crisis, or, the migrant caravans, whatever. The U.S. sent several warships into the Black Sea this year. This is kind of provocative towards Russia. In the past, this happened pretty infrequently. Last year, it was 5 times. This year, it's now 7. All right, important updates on the Julian Assange case. Apparently, he appeared in court today at a hearing in the UK. This was a hearing where his legal team had requested an extra, I believe, 3 months to prepare for the defense against the extradition. That request by the Assange team was denied by the judge. It really seems like, they're bent on giving him the most unfair trial possible. Of course, we know from reporting that he's been denied enough access to his lawyers and legal teams to build a real defense. We know his health condition has not been well, and from what I understood, he was maybe more stable, but not well recently. And I guess I want to say this with like an asterisk or something. So, maybe later on we find out it's not true, but at least from the reports I saw early about the hearing is that Assange did not look like he was in very good health. Now, again, in the past, it does seem that the mainstream media has really worked to smear Julian Assange and, maybe play up how critical his condition was for, various different kinds of reasons, mostly I think to make him look crazy. And so that could be the case here. You're reporting they had trouble saying his name and stuff like that. It's also possible that, the inhumane and cruel conditions that they're currently holding him in the UK are having a real impact on Assange. And it's time, that some action really needs to be taken, or, we could look at this guy dying a political prisoner. All right, there's several different kind of protest movements going on. And I just want to, mention these, and I'll have links in the show notes page if you want to, maybe look and learn a little bit more. But I only have kind of outside summaries here of a lot of them. In Chile, there's some protests going on. From my understanding, they at least started after some transportation subsidies were revoked. At least 3 people died in these protests, and apparently it was an arson in a supermarket. I'm not sure why the supermarket was targeted. If the people who died in the arson, were targeted, or just, kind of in the building at the time it got set on fire and got trapped there. There are reports that at least 2 protesters were shot by police, but I didn't see a death toll that said 5, so maybe they were shot in a way that they ended up living. Protests look fairly large. From what I could see on Twitter, it seems like, the left is very pro-protest on this one, but I really don't have many other details, and if it grows, I'll definitely keep my eye on it. One of the reasons I find is when protests and kind of instability break out in a country, the U.S. and especially the U.S. deep state, like the intelligence agencies, likes to get involved and try to scheme and force these things to play out in a certain way. And now if it's done in a very overt way, of course, it's only to make, this smooth and happy and to ensure that this has good results for the Chilean people or whatever. But, in reality, it's going to be very self-serving for the U.S. government. In Lebanon, again, it seems like we have large protests. I guess the cause seems to be general unhappiness with the economic situation in Lebanon. The hatred seems to be most directed at the Prime Minister Hariri. If you'll remember back on the show, this guy was actually kidnapped by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, when he was doing his big palace coup there and taking a whole bunch of power, because Hariri was insufficiently hostile to a major part of the Lebanese government and as Hezbollah's political party. Hariri said he had put forward some kind of bill that was, I guess, supposed to meet the demands of the protesters. So we'll see if that protest movement continues into the coming week. Protests continue in Catalonia, where people are very upset about the oppression of leaders of their independence movement. They had the vote there in 2017, where police beat up old ladies trying to vote, and then they imprisoned and just recently convicted the leadership of that independence vote. This is what sparked the most recent outbreak of protests. They've been massive, and there's even calls from people in the government to hold another independence vote. An interesting kind of protest in South Korea. 20 college students somehow got onto the grounds of the U.S. embassy, or the home of the U.S. diplomat to South Korea, and then try to enter the house in protest of U.S. troops being stationed in South Korea. They were, of course, arrested. Not sure. Hopefully they'll be let go. I don't know if this is part of a wider movement. I mean, in the past on the show, I have talked about, protest movements in South Korea showing up at THAAD missile sites or other U.S. military bases and saying, go the hell home, Americans. But, this may just kind of be a one-off event of what kids are doing. The U.S. is also reported to have offered the North Koreans some kind of partial sanctions relief in return for shutting off a large part of their nuclear program. The Moon of Alabama blog pointed out, and I just thought this was interesting, that Kim Jong-un recently hopped on a white horse and rode to the top of some sacred mountain. And this is something that typically happens in North Korea before he makes a big announcement. It's also a reflection of, this country being, kind of having this very weird relationship with, the leader that almost represents some kind of deity, really oppresses his own people. So I'm just going to kind of keep an extra eye towards North Korea for the next week or so and see what Kim Jong-un has to do and say. All right, in Afghanistan, record number of civilian casualties between July and September of this year. So think about this. 18 years into this war, and we're now saying record highs for casualties. Of course, I'm guessing part of it is Donald Trump's probably the president who sets out, just based on how his personality is if his people are bringing him big numbers, it probably makes it seem like they're doing a lot to him. And so rather maybe than an Obama who was kind of advocating to keep the Afghan war on the back burner. And of course, this meant that, U.S. troops were dying and he had his base surge and everything. But for the rest of the time, maybe have as little violence there as possible to attract as many news stories. And that kind of policy has its own problems. It's just the continual repression of the Afghan people. And, people do die in airstrikes and, in the insurgency and everything like that. But Donald Trump probably likes to see big numbers of airstrikes. That's just my take on maybe why this is going on. And especially as maybe Trump is putting a lot of pressure on his people to do what they need to do and get out. It's interesting. We have Mark Esper traveling to Afghanistan. And then in this Reuters report on his travels, it mentions a couple interesting things. One is that Esper was looking to restart the negotiations with the Taliban. And in the report, it said that a senior administration official being, sourced anonymously said that they were looking at trying to figure out what to do in Afghanistan because since the president was apparently serious about getting out of Syria, maybe he's actually serious about getting out of Afghanistan. Now, another interesting admission from Mark Esper while he was in Afghanistan is that the U.S. could reduce their troop numbers to 8,600, from 14,000 that we have right now, and not fight counter-terrorism missions, which seems to be the main purpose that we're in Afghanistan since the last three presidents have ran on no nation building. Of course, Bush and Obama both tried to build a nation in Afghanistan after saying that, but, that was kind of the campaign pledge and promise or whatever. And now we have thousands of more troops than we need in Afghanistan. Another statement that Esper made that now, for me, this was made, these reports were a day before. Afterwards, he says that the U.S. is a longtime ally in the Afghan government and we wouldn't abandon them like the Kurds. And then, give some more nuance saying that, hey, look, the Kurds were being invaded by our Turkish allies. And this is a far different situation where you have the Afghan government fighting against the Taliban. So maybe he's a little less serious about restarting talks than I had maybe hoped the day before. But nonetheless, Esper did travel to Afghanistan and looking to restart talks. Violence in Afghanistan, you saw the numbers there. And of course, a majority of those, I believe, are still coming from U.S. weapons. But there is the terrorist group, the Islamic State, and the insurgency, the Taliban, that are brutalizing civilians as well. Recently, 62 people were killed in the bombing of a mosque. As far as I can tell, no group, whether it's the Islamic State or the Taliban, has come forward admitting to that yet. All right, let's got a few quick updates on Syria before we wrap up here. At least some U.S. troops, reports say between 70 and 100 military vehicles have left eastern Syria for western Iraq. That's where the U.S. troops will be redeployed and still in the fight against ISIS. So these troops aren't coming home. That's extremely disappointing. I guess, still a good thing that they're not in Syria. And at this point, I suppose, with all the other geopolitics happening in Syria, they're, causing less of a problem and disturbance in western Iraq. Although, let's get them out of western Iraq next. The other problem is somebody must have talked to Trump and now he's considering leaving 200 troops in eastern Syria somewhere to defend some oil fields and also fight against ISIS, and the Jordanians and the Israelis will be able to stay longer for that reason as well. Hopefully Donald Trump doesn't go along with this plan. It seems absolutely ridiculous to me that we would leave 200 troops in Syria. Like there's some magic force field or something around Americans that means they can't get shot by Syrian or Russian bullets or something like that. I don't know, but eventually Assad will look to retake the oil fields in Syria. I mean, these are, within Syria's geographical bounds. And if the U.S. is taking the oil, it's probably going far less to the Syrian people than if Assad does. Now, as this podcast gets released, there will be a few hours left on the peace deal. If you're listening to the podcast, even maybe a day after it's released, the whole ceasefire that Trump negotiated in northern Syria along the border with Turkey will probably be expired. Trump says there's a few violations, but it's generally holding. The Turks are saying the Kurds aren't meeting their obligations, And as far as I could tell, the Kurds are saying that Turkey is attacking them throughout the ceasefire. I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen when the ceasefire expires. I guess the best case scenario is that Assad, Russia, Turkey, maybe in Iran are all right now in negotiations and figuring out how this is going to be resolved in a way that not a whole bunch of people, have to die. All right. And, Syria is probably going to be a big subject on the next show and, shows in the coming few weeks here. So, keep an eye out for news on that. And I'll be talking about a lot on the show. Hope you're all enjoying it. Let me know if you got anything to say. There's a Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. Online Libertarian Institute is where you find the show to share it. And patreon.com/foreign policy focus.